Well, today we're going to discuss a little bit of obscure Ford history on one of its most seminal vehicles, the 1949 Ford. But the story of the 1949 Ford's design really begins with this tractor that you see here, Ford's NAA Golden Jubilee tractor that was introduced for 1953. Now, how in the world could the design of the 49 Ford have something to do with this 1953 tractor? Obviously, this was produced after the 1949 Ford was introduced. Well, hold that thought for one moment and let me tell a little bit of the story. The first is that this Golden Jubilee tractor that you see here was designed by a firm known as the George W. Walker Industrial Design Firm, led by George W. Walker. And George Walker's firm was really an industrial design firm that had an international reputation by this point and numerous clients, including Nash Calvinator, not only for the cars, the Nash vehicles, but also for Calvinator appliances. George Walker's design firm had a heavy hand in those. And George Walker's design firm also had a heavy hand in the automotive space before it joined up with Ford. Most notably, they had helped Packard design the first Clipper to much success. So the George Walker design firm was something akin to Raymond Loewy and Associates, but also very prestigious and, as I said, had numerous accounts with lots of different auto companies and companies requiring industrial design services. Now, George W. Walker was the leader of this eponymous firm, and there were a number of talented designers that were on staff at George W. Walker. That included a gentleman by the name of Joe Oros, as well as somebody who perhaps is even a bit more famous than Joe Oros, and that is Elwood Engel. Elwood Engel would later go on to become the head of Chrysler Design for a number of years after he would leave Ford after having been the chief designer on the Lincoln Continental for 1961. Joe Oros would go on to great fame at Ford and be one of the lead designers on the first Mustang. But both of these individuals worked for George W. Walker, and George Walker would actually eventually become Ford's design chief in the mid-1950s. But there's a whole interesting story associated with that, and really dating back to the 49 Ford, and let's get back to this 1953 Ford Golden Jubilee tractor. Now, an important thing to note about this tractor was that it was designed, as I mentioned, by George W. Walker's industrial design firm. And the individual who was the lead designer for the Golden Jubilee tractor was none other than Joe Oros, whom I just mentioned, who would later go on to lead the design of the Ford Mustang. And one of the things that's interesting about the Golden Jubilee tractor was that it was produced by Ford after there was a spat between Henry Ford as well as Ferguson, who made Ferguson tractors. There was an original pair-up between Ford and Ferguson to make tractors. Now, the design that you saw that made its way to the 1953 NAA Golden Jubilee tractor was actually proposed by Joe Oros when he was working for George W. Walker as the design for a Ferguson tractor in the mid-1940s. But it was rejected. Apparently, the Ferguson board thought that their tractor should, as opposed to resemble what you saw on the Golden Jubilee tractor, have a Rolls-Royce style front end. Now, interestingly, the Ferguson tractors never got that kind of a front end, but regardless, the George Walker proposal was rejected for that Ferguson tractor, and Joe Oros just basically warmed it over and put it on the Golden Jubilee tractor for Ford that came out in 1953. Now, Joe Oros was also one of the designers on the 1949 Ford. And do you notice a striking similarity between the Golden Jubilee tractor here and the front end of the 1949 Ford? Well, you should. And they also were done by the same design firm. That's right, these were done by the same design firm. George W. Walker did both the Golden Jubilee tractor as well as the 1949 Ford. In fact, many people don't realize that the 1949 Ford's design was not actually done in-house by their design team, which was headed by Bob Gregory at the time. In fact, Ford's leadership, led by Ernie Breach at this time, thought that the original in-house design proposals for the 49 Ford just were not befitting of the brand. They thought they were too large and they were going to be too costly to produce. So they contracted with George W. Walker's design firm to come up with alternate proposals. And the internal studio was really dueling with George W. Walker's external design firm for the design of the 49 Ford. And you can guess who won. Bob Gregory's internal proposal, which apparently was in plan view more flat and more traditionally proportioned with what I guess I'd call the double roll, if you will. And what do I mean by that? If you look at the A-pillar and the surfacing by the A-pillar, you'll notice that the hood kind of rolls under. There's the first roll, and then there's this kind of flat area, and then there's another roll for the fender. So 2 radiuses, which was very typical at the time at the A-pillar area. And you can see in the picture here, this is actually Bob Gregory's team's model that they prepared as their proposal for the 49 Ford. And there's no spinner on the front at all. And it's got like this air intake up front, as well as a, I guess you could call it perforated bumper, or bumper with these air holes in it. It looks kind of like a heavier design, shall we say, than the actual production 49 Ford. But let's contrast the styling of the front end of this Bob Gregory proposal with the final 49 Ford, which was done by George W. Walker's firm. Now take a look at that A-pillar area again, and you'll notice that the double roll is not present here. You just have this extremely clean, unbroken belt line that goes from the edge of the fender all the way back to the edge of the quarter panel, and provides this beautiful linear surface that really was unlike anything that had been seen to date. And of course, you have the iconic spinner front end, the aircraft-inspired front end on the 49 Ford that was also allegedly a brainchild of Joe Oros. Now, many people claim credit for the 49 Ford, and there's a little bit of Joe Oros and Elwood Engel and some other designers in it, but Oros was certainly a leading figure in the design of this particular vehicle. Now, as we look out back again at the Bob Gregory team proposal, you'll see it looks heavy yet again compared to the George Walker 49 Ford and what made it into production. There's some interesting strakes there on the C-pillar, but that roof just looks chunky and heavy, and the quarter panel almost looks insubstantial when you compare it to the roof. It looks like it's kind of collapsing under the weight of that heavy roof. It's not a very pretty proposal, let's just say, from the Bob Gregory team. You also have that shoulder that's beneath the daylight opening, and you also have I guess you could call it a bone line that runs the length of the car, and some trim that accentuates it. Just again, not a happy proposal. Now you can imagine when an external design firm's proposal is chosen over the in-house design firm, well, that doesn't say much or bode well for the team that's in-house. And as you can imagine, Bob Gregory quit after George Walker's design team's proposal was the one that was accepted for the 49 Ford. I wonder if some of that had to do with, let's just say, Walker and his ability to curry favor with some of the new leadership at Ford, including Ernie Breach, who was hired away to work at the Ford Motor Company from General Motors, in part to help teach the young Henry Ford II how to run an automobile company. George Walker and Ernie Breach were apparently good friends at the time, and maybe that helped a little bit, but I don't think Bob Gregory and that team did themselves any favors with the proposal that you saw either. And as I mentioned, George Walker would actually later go on to become head of Ford Design in the mid-1950s. And, of course, Joe Oros and Elwood Engel would come along and be hired into Ford Design along with him as permanent employees. While Elwood Engel would go and depart to become the chief designer over at Chrysler after the 1961 Continental was released, Oros would stay. As I mentioned, he would lead a number of Ford designs, including that first Ford Mustang. But an interesting story there, the way that Ford Golden Jubilee tractor, which was based on a rejected proposal for a Ford Ferguson tractor from the mid-1940s, that theme kind of made its way onto the 1949 Ford and was done by an external design firm, not the internal design team at Ford. Pretty convoluted story about how one of the most seminal vehicles in automotive history was designed, but that is the story behind it. Another interesting tidbit about the front end of the 49 Ford's design is that the engineers over at Ford were concerned that that big kind of faux propeller area in the middle of the front end was not going to allow for enough cooling to the radiator. But interestingly, Joe Oros, who really spearheaded that design, was an engineer by trade. He had actually started his career at General Motors in Cadillac, both design and engineering. And so Oros, by his own admission, had designed that kind of propeller-like shape to actually have a Venturi effect and to really speed up the air as it was going past it. So it did end up passing the cooling test that Ford engineers put forward for the 49 Ford, and they didn't end up having any issues. And again, it's probably a little bit of why Joe Oros was so successful was his background as both an engineer as well as a designer had served him well, not only on the 49 Ford, but also as he participated in a number of industrial design items for various George W. Walker clients, including Nash Calvinator. Thanks again for watching this little interesting tidbit of design history centered on the 49 Ford.